On a decisive day, a queen chose to die. No one understood why, not even the king. She walked down the forbidden hallway, alone, head held high. She knew one simple gesture could end her life. Guards raised their spears, silence swallowed the hall. The king stood still, but she didn't flinch, because what was at stake wasn't just her life, it was the survival of an entire people. She carried a secret, an identity the empire could never find out. The decree had been signed, the massacre had a date, and the only hope for deliverance stood before a scepter that might never be extended. This was the day a queen chose death, and gave herself up to stop the greatest empire on earth from making an irreversible mistake. What followed would be no less dangerous. Every second of what came next would decide who would fall, the queen, or the enemy. Nothing was more unsettling than the tension in Susa, especially around the throne. It was a place where even a wrong glance could cost you everything. An empire that believed itself eternal, propped up by fear, fragile alliances, and laws so absolute that not even the king could change them. This was the empire of Xerxes, not just a king, but a man who ruled over 127 provinces, from India to Ethiopia. His reputation stretched across continents. He was revered as a god, untouchable, unquestionable. The distance between him and his people was a chasm, and it was no accident, it was by design. The palace in Susa was more than a monument to luxury, it was the stage for an invisible war. Linen curtains hid strategies, soft rugs muffled footsteps that could seal destinies. The air was scented with perfume, but behind the scenes, there was the stench of conspiracy. Nothing there was simply ornamental, everything served a purpose, to remind everyone that, in that place, only the king was real. The feasts were constant, lavish, endless, and they were a disguise. Beneath the glitter of the banquets, between toasts and music, names were crossed out and alliances sealed. With each decree, a province trembled, with each gesture from the king, a life could be shaped, or erased. And there was something more, something that kept everyone on edge, a rule that was non-negotiable, cruel, and final. No one approached the throne uninvited, no one. Because in that room, before that man, protocol was more powerful than relationship. The scepter might rise, or it might not. Approaching the throne without being summoned wasn't just an offense, it was a defiance of the system itself, triggering an automatic sentence. The throne was guarded by soldiers, but it was the law that made it deadly. The empire lived by decrees, and died by them. But what would drive a king to create such a law? Was it the only way to hold an empire together? To protect a throne surrounded by enemies who wore perfume instead of swords? The answers weren't yet visible, but they were about to be. Something was coming, and once it began, no force would be able to stop the impact. In an empire where power was absolute and obedience meant survival, there was something even more dangerous than disobedience, being noticed for the wrong reasons. It was in that setting that she appeared, not as a warrior, not as a stranger, but as the most unlikely of choices. The palace announced a new beginning, a new queen. The former one, Vashti, had been discarded for displeasing the king in a single moment of defiance. Now, the command was clear. The most beautiful among the young women of the empire would be crowned. Beauty was required, a voice was not. And that's how Esther entered. Quiet, chosen from among hundreds, but carrying with her a secret that, if uncovered, would bring everything crashing down. Not even the king knew, nor his counselors. The new queen was not who they thought she was. Behind the jewels and fine robes was an identity carefully concealed. She belonged to a scattered, subdued, surviving people, and in that empire, belonging to such a people was dangerous. But she wasn't alone. Mordecai, the man who had raised her as his own daughter, watched from the shadows. He was the last link between her and her origin. A man who understood the empire, the backroom dealings, the power games, and more than that, he knew the cost of staying silent, and of speaking too soon. Why did Esther accept that role? Why didn't she say who she really was? Did she already know that in a game like this, revealing too much was the same as self-destruction, before the attack even began? In Susa, where everything was watched, where every gesture could be used against you, hiding who you are, was strategy. But how long can a secret survive in a palace where everyone pretends and everyone watches? Where even silence has eyes? What no one realized was that the danger had already passed through the gates, and had access to the throne, and very soon, it would reveal its face, and its name. While the palace celebrated the arrival of the new queen, another presence was gaining ground in the quiet halls of power. He wore no crown, yet his steps reshaped the course of laws, and unlike those who bowed before the throne, he knew exactly how to influence the one who sat on it. Haman was more than an official, he was a strategist hungry for power, cold, calculating, patient. His strength didn't come from the sword, but from the ruthless logic with which he manipulated others. He knew how to wait, he knew where to strike, and most of all, he knew how to hide his true intentions behind layers of loyalty. One day, a single moment rekindled something that had been dormant for centuries. After being promoted by the king, Haman became second in command in the kingdom, earning the fear and reverence of all palace officials, who bowed before him. But Mordecai refused to bow, not out of pride, but out of conviction, and in that instant, something broke inside the Persian official. What would have been just an isolated offense for anyone else became the spark of an ancient animosity. That's because Haman may have been a descendant of Agag, king of the Amalekites, a bloodline tied to Israel's old enemies, a legacy that carried not just memories, but deep, festering resentment, and in the face of one man's defiance, Haman didn't just want personal revenge, he wanted to erase Mordecai's entire people, to finish what his ancestors could not. And so, with speed and cold precision, a proposal was brought before the king, disguised as political strategy, framed as convenience. A decree to eliminate an undesirable people, scattered throughout the provinces, with their own customs, refusing to assimilate. Haman pitched the plan as a matter of order, a necessary decision, and Xerxes, trusting his closest advisor, sealed the decree with his royal signet ring. The massacre was scheduled, the date was set, the day of annihilation was now official. But there was one detail Haman had overlooked, a detail even the king didn't know. Among the condemned was the queen herself, and when the truth came out, it wouldn't just be the Jews who were in danger. The decree had been sealed, but in his obsession to wipe out a people, Haman triggered an invisible and opposite reaction, a response that was already in motion, silent, lethal, and about to explode before the throne. The queen still smiled in the halls of Susa, but outside, whispers already carried a sentence, with a date and a target. The empire didn't just allow it, it celebrated its own efficiency. As preparations for the massacre gained momentum, Mordecai tore his clothes at the city gates. It was a protest against the inevitable, a cry for awareness, and there, dressed in sackcloth and ashes, he sent a message no monarch ever wants to hear. But it wasn't addressed to the king, it was to the queen. She had to plead with the king on behalf of her people. When Esther received the message, she replied to her father, "Any man or woman who approaches the king without being summoned will be put to death. I haven't been called into his presence for over 30 days. Mordecai quickly answered, "Don't think that just because you're in the palace, you'll be spared." It wasn't a threat, it was a warning, a revelation. Esther's residence was no longer a refuge, the palace, once a fortress, had become a trap. Then he went further. In a declaration that would echo through the centuries, he said, "Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this?" It was a piercing, unforgettable question. The invisible woman would now have to become the face of a people marked for death. Esther, the young woman who had learned to survive in silence, would now have to raise her voice, not with gentle words, but with a radical act, to enter the throne room uninvited. It was forbidden, it was suicide, but it was the only path. The law was clear: to approach the king without being summoned was to declare your own death, unless the scepter was raised. And there, caught between fear and destiny, she said what no queen had ever dared say. "If I must die, I'll die." A short sentence, but one that split history in half. In that moment, no one realized the empire had already crossed an invisible line, and at the heart of the most guarded room on earth, a woman willing to risk everything was about to turn the course of destiny with her own hands. And when the king was finally forced to choose, there would be no more pretending that everything was under control. 3 days and 3 nights, no water, no food, no guarantee that, in the end, she'd still have a name to be called by. While the palace carried on with its protocols, a woman fasted in preparation for the greatest confrontation of her life. Nothing about it was symbolic. Every hour of fasting was a conscious vote for death. No negotiations, no conditions. The kind of decision you only make when everything else is already lost, and all that's left is to offer your soul as the final argument. Then she rose, dressed like a queen, adjusted everything to look majestic, and stepped onto a floor that offered no forgiveness for mistakes. There was no messenger, no warning, no exception. She hadn't been invited. To approach the king under those conditions was to challenge the very structure that held the empire together. Death was no longer a risk, it was a certainty. The hall stood still, guards all around, ready to carry out orders without hesitation. The throne at the back, elevated, cold, untouchable. The king seated, the scepter lowered, and time, frozen. Esther moved forward. The sound of her footsteps sliced through the silence with unbearable sharpness, one by one, like a countdown, like hammers striking her own fate. The king lifted his eyes, and saw, not a beloved wife, not a subject, but someone the empire was never prepared to recognize, a woman defying a sentence, with no shield, and no backup plan. And then, in a second that weighed like an entire lifetime, the scepter moved, slowly, deliberately, irreversibly. King Xerxes raised it, and death backed away. No one in that hall understood it, but something had been set in motion. The scepter had been lifted, and with it, an invisible battle had begun, where words were weapons, and the queen, she hadn't finished what she had started. Her life had been spared, but no victory had been won. What Esther needed now wasn't just courage, it was strategy, cold, calculated. She didn't rush, she didn't beg, she didn't reveal the reason behind her boldness. Instead, she invited the king to a banquet. An unexpected invitation, too simple to raise suspicion, yet perfect to lower every defense. The king accepted. Haman was invited too. The two most powerful men in the empire sat at the table with a woman who, by all appearances, only wanted to please. But there, as the wine flowed and the words danced, a hidden purpose began to take shape, subtle, silent, deadly. Esther revealed nothing, not that day, not the next. When the king asked what she wanted, the queen smiled, and scheduled another banquet. Once again, she delayed the truth, and by doing so, she moved pieces in secret, without revealing herself. While Haman was drunk on pride, convinced he was at the center of some rare honor, Esther was pulling the strings behind the curtain. She controlled the timing, the king's curiosity, and most of all, the enemy's vanity. Nothing in her posture showed urgency, nothing in her voice betrayed fear, but every move was precisely calculated to bring the king exactly where she needed him, to the center of the trap. This war didn't come with spears or threats, it came with gestures too gentle to seem dangerous, and when the king finally realizes what was prepared around his own table, it will be impossible to say he didn't see it. That night, the wine was the same, the setting familiar, but something in the air had shifted. The king still smiled, and Haman still felt honored. Only Esther knew what was about to unfold, and there was no more time for silence. She had brought the king to this moment, point by point, word by word. Every move she had made led to this very instant. At the height of the feast, the king asked, "What is your request? What is your desire?" With the king's eyes fixed on her, Esther finally spoke. "No detours, no embellishments. Spare my life, and the life of my people." For a second, nothing happened. The room kept breathing, as if it hadn't understood, but the king understood, and so did Haman. This wasn't just any statement, it was the key that connected all the pieces. The death decree, Esther's urgency, the reason for the invitation, the purpose of the second banquet. It all made sense. Queen Esther was Jewish. The king didn't just feel deceived, he felt used, but not by Esther. The betrayal was beside him, and it had a name, Haman. The man he trusted had twisted his authority to destroy the very woman he had crowned. The wife who now, standing before him, wasn't asking for protection, she simply let the truth fall onto the table like a final blow. Haman tried to react, but time was no longer on his side. The plan had crumbled, and with it, all the security he pretended to have. The gallows he had built for Mordecai now bore his name, and no one in the palace could pretend it was just a coincidence. Haman was dead, but the danger wasn't. In the Persian Empire, a royal decree wasn't just a decision, it was an irreversible sentence, signed, sealed, unchangeable. The extermination order still stood, like a blade suspended in the air, set to fall on a fixed day. Esther's revelation had saved her life, Haman's downfall had shaken the throne, but none of those victories canceled what was written, and what was written still threatened her entire people. Outside the palace, time was ticking, time was running out. The slaughter was drawing near, and there was no way to go back and undo the king's seal. That's when the strategy moved again. Esther, now seen not only as queen but as intercessor, took a bold new step. She didn't ask for the decree to be revoked, she asked for something bolder, for a new one to be issued, a parallel decree, an official permission for the Jews to defend themselves, to prepare, to fight. The request was granted. Mordecai drafted the counter-decree with the same authority that had once belonged to Haman. Horses were dispatched with urgency, messengers raced through the provinces, the new order was proclaimed. Now, the empire wouldn't witness a genocide, it would witness resistance. Now, the problem was no longer how to avoid the war, it was how to survive it. The day arrived, and this time, it didn't find a defenseless people. The Jews were ready, armed, alert, backed by an official decree that gave them the right to fight. And they fought. The war spread throughout the provinces, but the massacre didn't unfold the way Haman had planned, because those who were supposed to die fought back. For the first time, they weren't just targets, they were resistors, survivors. The empire witnessed deliverance, a wave of protection that changed the course of history. A people marked for death were now writing a new ending to their story. Nothing would be the same again, not for them, not for the throne, and it wasn't forgotten, it never would be, because out of that battle, a memory was born. Purim. A yearly celebration, a lasting reminder that death was overturned by a quiet decision, a plan shaped through fasting, courage, and strategy. A milestone where an empire couldn't stop one determined woman, and a single choice, made in the most unlikely moment, was enough to alter the destiny of an entire nation, and inscribe her name where time cannot erase it. They survived. More than that, they wrote a new chapter that even the throne of the most powerful kingdom couldn't stop, because when everything seemed lost, it wasn't strength, or swords, or shouting that changed the story, it was the mission of a woman, a decision made in the dark, a risk taken without guarantees, a faith that moved through sealed decrees and announced deaths. The most powerful empire in the world was nearly undone by one man, nearly collapsed from within without a drop of blood, but it was saved by a woman the enemy never saw as a threat, a queen who, under the weight of a crown, crafted the most dangerous plan of that reign, and won. Esther didn't use a throne, she used time, she used strategy, she used silence, and in the end, when the scepter was raised, it wasn't just her life that was spared, it was an entire generation that could breathe again. On that day, Esther chose to die, and there, between the scepter and the silence, a woman became a miracle. Now tell me, how many times has fear tried to silence you? How many times was the decree already signed, and all you had was faith, courage, and time working against you? The good news is, the story isn't over yet, and maybe what you're facing today is just the beginning of what God is about to rewrite. What did you think of this story? If it was what you were hoping for, please give it a like, not just to support us, but because it tells YouTube you want to see more stories like this. That way, it will recommend more content that feeds your faith and your vision. And if you want to keep diving into stories just as powerful as this one, there's an amazing video waiting for you in the description and on the end screen. Click it and discover another part of the Bible that will leave you speechless. Now leave a comment below, which part of this story hit you the hardest? And what would you do if you were in Esther's place? Sometimes, all God needs to change a story is someone willing to use their voice when everyone else goes silent.